And that was a really scary example because that developer had so much power because he was a maintainer and he was able to commit that code and inflicted malware on dozens of corporations, and many of them still don't know, right? And it's only in a particular version. So when you have these insider threats to these large repositories that are being used and leveraged by thousands of corporations in the open source world, it's arguably too easy for an individual developer to commit code and then have it propagate to thousands of companies and cause major damage.
Security, we need security.
We're at a point where there's these single points of failure within our software supply chain that can have devastating impacts. And it's no longer requires, an advanced threat. It just requires someone that's really angry one day or that's rebelling against something in the world, and they can commit the code, they can make the change themselves. And before you know it, thousands of companies are now struggling with this.
Hello and welcome to Dev Academy podcast, your gateway to the insights and wisdom of prominent experts and engineers from around the globe. I'm your host, Bartosz from Dev Academy, and it's my mission to help you glean insightful knowledge from the vast experiences of our distinguished guests. Each week we will delve into timeless topics in software development, focusing on crucial areas like security, quality, and design. Join us as we unravel the complexities of software engineering, offering you a practical, in-depth perspective. Let's embark on this enlightening journey together and transform the way we create and understand software. Hello, Seth. Welcome to the show. And how about you just introducing a little bit yourself to our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to be here. Just to give a background context, so I grew up just playing every single video game possible, but it quickly grew into PC gaming and MMOs and strategy games and quite a bit of StarCraft and a lot of other games that required my words per minute to upskill very fast. And so quickly typing became my competitive advantage. And soon I started to have the opportunity to work in IT. So as early as when I was 14 was my first internship that I had at a local IT managed service provider. And I had a chance to begin wiring patch cables and fixing viruses in laptops and learning about different operating systems. But that's really what started my interest. And then I decided to pursue probably about 5 years working on the IT managed services side before starting my own consulting firm. And then while I was at college or during my university studies, I ended up building a health tech company and did that for about 2.5 years, focusing in PTSD and trauma. And then afterwards, I decided, how can I bring my two different skill sets together? And that's how I ended up in cybersecurity, because it was a really good convergence between some of the skills that I had in technology growing up, as well as a lot of innovation and entrepreneurship and fast changing pace of technology within the cyber industry as a whole. And so now I've been in both IT and information security and application security specifically for a little bit over 10 years now. And then within the last 3 to 5 years, focusing predominantly on vulnerability management, secure SDLC, DevSecOps enablement, application security. And so that brings me to my current role today, where I'm over at Double Verify. We're a publicly traded ad tech company. And I support application security for about 350 global engineers and developers from all over the world. And I built their program essentially from greenfield, meaning that when I first came into the door, there was very little of what resembled an application security program. And now, over 2.5 years later, we have a pretty well mature and robust and forever growing program that can support the need of our global engineers and developers. And so I'm privileged to have that opportunity, and I'm really glad to be here. So thank you.
That is impressive. Ladies and gentlemen, we have 10 years of experience in the field, so it's going to be exciting to get all the flesh out of Seth in order to give us some insights and knowledge and tips and insights when it regards to the application security. Can you remind me the number of engineers that you mentioned in the organization?
350, and we're probably about 1,200, 1,300 in the company. So almost
Wow.
25, 30% of our company is engineers or software developers. And we have like two big engineering hubs. So one of them's in Israel and then one of them's in the US. And I think alone that probably makes up about 70% of our engineering talent. The other 30% is in the West Coast in the US, in Germany, in Belarus, in India. So we're scattered quite a bit all over the world.
That's fantastic. So before we jump into the topic of application security and the technical stuff, I mean, if you could time travel, would you travel to the past or the future? And how far and why would you go there?
Yeah, so for me, I'm a very futuristic person, and I always reflect on the past, but I try never to dwell on the past. So for me, going to the future is probably the uh, where I hope to be, and I would say in the short term, I think in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see dramatic improvements in robotics and AI and AGI and the combination of it together that will actually benefit human beings. And so I think in the near term, there's still a lot of work being done on um, basic skills. But I think in the next five and definitely within the next 10 years, like we will have robotics in our homes that will help us perform day to day tasks that we never thought were possible. And so I imagine they already have shops, some across the world, where they have robotics making your coffee every single morning. So you can go and you pay, and the robot's doing every single task from cupping the espresso to turning it on to serving it to you. And I don't think we're too far away from having that in our homes. And so that's
So
going to be
it
really
doesn't.
exciting.
So you don't want to travel. You just were anticipating eagerly the nearest future to see how the robots
I mean, I would love
and
to travel there, but I think the interesting part is that at the rate of change that we currently live in today, we're already traveling. Like we are moving fast, and so I don't find the need to teleport because I really appreciate the now. But I
I get
think
it.
that we have a lot coming ahead of us, and it's only going to accelerate. And so I'm really looking forward to it.
Before we continue with our insightful conversation, I'd like to share something that I'm really proud of: the Web Security Dev Academy Bootcamp. I created this program to help developers like you deepen their knowledge in web security. If that sounds interesting, you can join our exclusive waiting list to be notified about the next launch and start receiving tailor-made security tips. This is not a usual online course, but group-based cohort training with my direct support. To join the waiting list, visit websecurity-academy.com. It's websecurity-academy.com, or check the links in the description. If Bootcamp isn't quite what you are looking for at the moment, there is another way to support us. Please consider rating this podcast on your preferred platform or leaving a comment on YouTube. Your feedback is incredibly appreciated and helps others discover our content. Also, if today's conversation sparks any ideas or if you find it useful, don't hesitate to share this podcast with friends or colleagues in the tech community. Your endorsement helps us reach and inspire more developers. Thanks for your support, and now back to our conversation. I would like to make a main theme of this show an application security maturity within the organization and how it relates to developers, teams, management, products, and different angles. So, what would you say about like this journey toward app security or app security maturity? What can be the different milestones, challenges? I mean, from the bird's eye view, how do you see it? Like as you mentioned, from the greenfield to the mature position that you can say, yeah, we did a uh, good job.
Yeah, so there's many different frameworks out there that can help you with this. But from my point of view, the very beginning of an application security program starts with knowing your company, knowing your people, and knowing your applications. and what your company considers an application, right? The very initial stages of your application security program maturity is mostly going to be opening up communication channels with the right stakeholders, building initial bill of materials, whether it's on the software infrastructure, but knowing how your company operates, knowing what processes exist today, and knowing who's responsible for what application. And I think having a responsible party will set your program up for success, because as you begin to identify issues or triage or require stakeholder buy-in, it's most important to know your engineering and software development leadership across your organization. So setting up initial meetings, initial interviews with all of them, and then simultaneously doing so that's the top down, and then also bottom up together. And the bottom up approach is then, finding the developers across the world or across every team that really like security, wants to learn more, and empower them as much as you can by opening up additional communication channels with them. So for example, when I was at my current employer as well as previous employers, the biggest step that I had when I was building my program is to open up, direct communication channels with each engineering team, build a high level inventory, or what I call like a tech landscape overview document, which shows what is the engineering team, who's responsible, which DevOps engineer supports them, who from product supports them, do they have sensitive data, and building like this map of our environment. And then the third piece of it is doing like what I call a monthly forum or a monthly application security forum. So on a monthly basis, for the first 12 months that I was building the program, I would bring everyone in as like mostly a volunteering effort. So all the leadership, VPs, SVPs, you name it, and then even the brand new out of college engineers to join, and explain to them where the program is, where we're hoping to go, what we achieved, where they need to provide their input, or where I request input from them. And so this is a really good place to like start your program. And then what I consider like a very mature program is that a lot of the code you're building is policy as code. So if you're designing a new API, for example, like there is already a set restriction put in place so that way you can't deviate from the guardrails that are available to you. And you have these paved roads that you can take, very similar to like a Netflix model, where developers have some wiggle room as long as they're in the guardrails. And so that allows them the autonomy that they need to push code fast and innovate without getting into too many restrictions along the way. The second piece of it, for example, is also doing like automated threat modeling. So having a team or individuals that are threat modeling every single new change or component that's being introduced. Having a robust security champion program where not only is the application or product security team the ones leading the efforts, but actually the champions are the ones that are leading efforts already with their teams. And I think from a tooling perspective, like you've already built a probably data warehouse where you're aggregating all your application metrics and information and getting it prioritized properly and then distributed out to the right stakeholders to reduce your mean time to remediate. You have very strict KPIs already that are developed, and you're trying to meet those KPIs on a regular basis. And then that's what's being reported up to your leadership, to your board, to your audit committee, depending on the type of company that you're at. So realistically, there's a big journey between just meeting your stakeholders and then having some of the sample requirements that I just mentioned of a very mature program. But in many cases, you can align this to the Capability Maturity Model Index, or CMMI, is a really good way to measure the efficiency of your program. And this is obviously in 5 different levels. So it starts ad hoc, where your program is extremely manual to like fully optimized at the very end. And from 1 to 5, there's significant improvements that need to be made across the board. But ultimately, I think the best way to start for any organization is to get that first application security focused individual on board, because that individual, or product security or DevSecOps, whatever you want to call it, every company has different naming conventions these days, but getting an individual who's solely responsible for the success of this program is the best first step that you can take to begin this process or this journey.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned a lot of interesting terms that I would like to, pull into the conversation. So before we jump into, what can a single individual do, from the bottom up, uh, um, there were two keywords I would like you to put some focus on. First of all, you mentioned security champion. Who is a security champion? Is this like a day-to-day developer in the team? Is it a special guy who just walks around and punishes people from not addressing the standards, or it's some other entity in the team? How can we think about this security champion?
Yeah, so I think security champions change depending on the maturity of your program. So to start off, the individuals that I consider security champions are people who have an interest in security. That's it. So like they're an engineer, they're a software developer, and they like the content that I'm sending out. They subscribe to security newsletters. Like they have some personal interest or motivation that's enabling them to be a little bit more proactive. Like if you're holding office hours or if you're holding training sessions, like they're always the ones to show up because they're intrinsically motivated to become a better programmer by learning security and security features. That changes over time, right? So the initial security champion is what I'll call people that express interest early on. And it's good to be more communicative with those individuals, set up proper communication channels, and make sure that they feel important and included in what you're building. And one way to do that, for example, is anytime you're drafting out a new process change or a program change or a new policy, getting their input and asking for their input is always helpful. In the initial stage, it's definitely a volunteer based mentality. But as your program grows, you might want a security champion per engineering team, or you may want security champions that focus in specialized functions across your environment. So you might have a security champion that's really good at infrastructure as code. You might have a security champion that's really good at containerization and containerized workloads. You might have a security champion that's really good in Python, right? And over time, those security champions will grow and niche down to be more relevant. And so that way, if someone comes and they have a question and it's like, oh, this is a Java related question, then you might have a Java security champion who can best assist because they know the language the best. They've spent more time learning best practices and training in, for example, OWASP top 10 findings. But when you start, it's really just finding the individuals that they have some intrinsic motivation, some interest, and then opening up that communication channel with them.
I mean, this is a great answer because it actually, I would say, helps to see the potential for every potential listener who is a developer to aspire for this position or this kind of responsibility in the company. You don't need a security program. You don't need some kind of frameworks. Based on what you said, it's a great start if one has just a intrinsic motivation to just speak up, to hey, let's just analyze this because I can see potential threats, or maybe I have some better way to do this. Maybe we should think about it, or whatever it is. I mean, there's no need for any labels. There's no need for any frameworks. Just the motivation to upskill the security within the organization, within the company, or just their own interest in that particular matter. That's fantastic. I mean, this will probably kick some motivation in the listeners to actually get interested in this topic. So You mentioned also an interesting term, guardrails. I'm interested in how would you define if someone is actually new to this, security championship. I'm doing a software for several years. I love it. But I feel like, okay, I found this podcast, I found this show. I want to jump into this because I feel like I'm lacking it. And there are a lot of terms. Like one of them that I hear that might be something new is like, oh, you need to, be in a given guardrails. How would you define it specifically, technically, from a developer perspective, this term?
Yeah, so a guardrail, in my opinion, is a preventative control that you can put in place. It may be at the software level, it may be at the hardware level, maybe at the infrastructure, depending on how you're deploying your applications. And these guardrails prevent a developer from accidentally performing a misconfiguration. Um, so a good example of a guardrail is I don't want a cloud-based bucket to be externally facing. That's like
Mhm.
a very basic guardrail. And so you can build the policy, put it in place so that way only with an exception can a bucket be externally facing, but by default, it's always private. And so this is a very good example of a high level guardrail that you can put in place where, let's say you have a lot of security findings in your organization because you have all these buckets that are publicly exposed. Rather than making it public by default, make it private by default, and then put in a rule so that way you cannot make it public without getting an exception approved. And so this is a really good example of a more infrastructure related guardrail. But that way, when a developer is building an application, they no longer accidentally make a bucket externally facing, right? And so in code, for example, like one way that you can do this is, for example, if you're building an API and you want a developer to follow a style guide, right? Um, you can build in a preventative control that says if you do not follow the style guide, then we're not going to push your code into production, right? Or merge your code into production. And so there's other preventative controls that you can do at the software level as well that will guide your developers to make better decisions as they continue to grow and scale, etc.
So can we say it's kind of like a quality gate focused on the security?
Correct. Yep. And I think it's best to initially say it doesn't have to be security, right? The guardrails can be security, but as I was saying just in my previous example, right, like a style guide isn't necessarily security.
Mhm.
But it's something really helpful for developers to follow because then they're not uh, building their own framework, right? It's like the more preventative controls you can build for your developers, the less likely they are to make mistakes. And then that also allows the developers to still stay on the paved road without breaking out of the guardrails. So guardrails are meant to be preventative. They're meant to act as a control. And yeah, I think the quality gate is a really good example. But guardrails don't necessarily have to be security focused. They can also be DevOps focused. They can be more product focused. And you can build these guardrails in whatever fashion you want, right? So there's
Mhm.
many different models for them.
Cool. Yeah, thank you for that. So, if we continue on this focus on developers and development, I mean, what are the major learning curves for developers during this journey? So how do you address them? If you are going through this, you might be the owner of the program, but on the bottom in the organization, there are people, there are developers that are writing this code, and what is the learning curve that you know average developer who just learns, okay, now we have some new guidelines, rules, and what is the scenario that developers writing physical code, or in these days maybe some AGI or LLM writing for them, but in the end of the day, the code is going to end in the repo, in either in the development phase, staging, or production. But there's a lot of to cover. So how one can find themselves in this process from the hands-on coding?
Yeah, so I think there's two major prerequisites that are required here. One, as I mentioned earlier, communication channels are super important. So having open communication channels with your developers. So if they have questions at any given point in time, they know who to contact and how to contact them and get feedback or input. The second piece of it is really focused on learning and development, which is critical for the success of developers to understand issues, right? The biggest challenge that I see in developers is, especially if they're new, meaning that they have, like, let's say less than 2 years of practical hands-on experience working, um, they may or may not understand security best practices. So what's a good example of that? Like a very new developer might still hard code secrets, right? They might not understand that secrets shouldn't be hard coded. But in order to communicate that effectively with them, you A, need to have that communication channel open, and B, you need to have either existing training that you can share or build a training for that developer so that way they understand that A, hard coding secrets is really bad, and B, they shouldn't do it moving forward. And C, what are mitigating controls that you can put in place if you have to do that, right? Or what options do you have? Maybe it's a secret manager, maybe it's a vault, maybe it's some way to actually protect the passwords and explain to the developers what good looks like and what bad looks like, which seems to be a very simple concept. But when you're doing this at scale with thousands and thousands of developers, like, it's most likely going to happen. And then the question is how do you handle it? And what is the sensitivity of these secrets that you're putting in? And are there different rules that might apply to a production versus a external production application versus an internal production application, or an external production application versus an internal tool, right? That's just being used. But the reality is that a focus on education and awareness needs to be done from as essentially day one. Like when a developer joins your organization, you should have some sort of best practices put in place, whether it's based on OWASP, whether it's based on just generic policies that you have in your organization, explaining to them about licensing and understanding these are major challenges that I think every single organization faces, but you have to start somewhere. And I think the best place is, day one, developer joins your organization, they're automatically getting a message from the team, opening up that communication channel, giving them a link to your internal wiki or resources or training that you use, and then having them begin to understand what tools or processes or policies do you have in place. What do they need to follow, or what should they follow as they adopt to their organization? And then that way, as you roll out new tooling or new scanning capabilities or new detection mechanisms, you don't have to retrain them on how to triage because you've already trained them when they stepped in the door. So the more communication, training, and awareness that you can have, the better it's going to be for all developers. And that also includes management too.
Mm-hmm. I mean, let's talk about it a little bit more, because it's very interesting, because I can tell from my own experience that whenever you join a new organization and you are thrown a bunch of wikis or tutorials, I would say it's a little bit challenging to get yourself around all the things. And just to make an example based on what you said, get a new developer. It doesn't really mean that they are junior or senior. They are just new. This is important. They are just new. They might have an experience in development, but when you throw a 50 pages of wiki, now you have to obey to the rules. I mean, they're not going to do this from the day one. I'm not
Yeah.
even sure if they are going to ever, feel comfortable in this position. So, everybody wants to do effective job as well as, obey to some security guidelines. But uh, is there any better way than just throwing a bunch of PDFs or wikis in the face of a new guy or uh, whoever joins the team? Hey, now you read it and you obey from today. I mean,
Yeah.
how to
So
tackle this problem?
there's a learning curve. It is a problem. Like when you join any organization right off the bat, you get information overload. Uh, at my current employer, one of the tactics that I've done is that after a new developer joins, the automated messaging system waits a couple weeks. So they're not getting it like the day they join, but they're getting it within 30 days of joining, right? So it gives them a little bit of time to familiarize themselves with the environment. And then with that message is it's short, it's concise, and it just points them to the resources that they need or who to contact if they have questions. And then the way that we've automated a lot of our tooling is that as soon as they make their first commit, they're going to start seeing the security scans right off the bat. And I think that's one of the most important ways is that A, they're going through their training, they're onboarding, they make their first commit, they're already starting to see security results pop up. If they have questions, they can always revert back to that automated messaging, or in that automated messaging, it also has the Slack channel that they can contact us, right? So because we've opened up those communication channels way in the beginning, now they're able to go and immediately begin understanding who's in charge, who can they reach out to for support, are their managers monitoring this, do they have any sprint time dedicated to security issues, and all of that becomes super relevant because after they make their first commit during their training period, they're going to say, oh, what is this tool, right? What is this doing? What is it looking for? And then most likely they'll go to their manager and say, oh man, manager, what is the expectations that I have from a security requirements perspective, right? And then that opens up the dialogue even more. And because you have already existing communication channels with all the management, now they know what they're responsible for. They know how much sprint time maybe they should be allotting to security remediations. And so overall, you're given a really good holistic view as a developer when you join. But it's also good to not scare them away. And so as you mentioned, like if you go in and there's 50 pages of trainings and recorded videos and they're assigned to you, it creates a lot of issues, right? And so the approach that I've did is it's more of a voluntary mechanism in the beginning, and we don't force a lot on new developers. We let them get on board, we ramp them up, we make sure that they have all the resources that are required, and then as they begin to settle in, maybe after the initial 90 days, that's when we may assign them a training, for example. That's when we may say, hey, we noticed that you haven't logged into X, Y, or Z tool, and automate some messaging to them to get them to be a little bit more proactive. But the reality is you don't want to overwhelm them when they first join. It's definitely a problem. And in many cases, they're already dumped information, but you also don't want to be transparent or invisible. Like you want to make your presence known. You want them to realize that you're there as a resource and that you're there to help them and support them as they continue to grow within the organization. And what's always nice too is if you, not necessarily like a leaderboard, but some sort of recognition. And I think today that's what's been very helpful for us is being able to show newer developers, whether they're, 10 years of experience, 20 years of experience, and say, look, we're going to recognize our best security champions or individuals that have done a really good job. And if you want your name on this list, then you should probably start talking to us a little bit more. So I think showing them what great looks like as well from the beginning gives them a really good idea of how they can move from a novice security individual in your organization to being a security champion, and showing them that journey and being able to visualize it.
I love the idea of the leaderboard. Do you have any particular example of how this can be implemented? For example, to motivate new joiner to hopping in? Because me personally, I'm turbo motivated by this kind of leaderboards, or gamification, if you will. That some kind of like, I'm doing a lot of learning, and when I'm using some resource for learning, let's say Duolingo, and all those points and all those strikes, and then hey, you didn't do this today. You don't want to lose your 1 or 2 month strike. Just make a training today. It motivates you because you kind of like feel the progress, right? And this is great what you mentioned, that you can use the same tools or motivation ways to get people, even though it's challenging at the beginning, to actually take active part. I mean, do you have any particular example? Do you think, okay, the person who finds the most security vulnerabilities is going to be listed, or someone who reviews the most PRs in regards to security findings? How could you implement this?
There's many different options, and depending on your organization, some things are going to fit and work well and some things are not. But I think at the simplest level, you can break it up into monetary and non-monetary based awards, right? So if you're lucky and you're in like a non-regulated company and you have a little bit of budget, you can always get like Starbucks gift cards or Amazon gift cards or something that like people enjoy, depending on where you live. And then use that as incentives for developers. So say, okay, we noticed that, let's say these were the top 3 developers this month to close out the most amount of security findings or security issues, or resolve the most amount of pain points that the security team has. And so that's a really good starting point, right? Just doing like a project-based identification. So, we had this major security issue. This is the developer engineer that helped fix it. And at the end of the month, we're going to say, congratulations, John. John's going to be getting a $5 Starbucks gift card this month, like something along those lines. Not all organizations can go the monetary route, right? So then it's like, what is the non-monetary options that you can take if you don't have an additional budget to work with? And I think that leaderboards is a really good option. Being able to just recognize those individuals, like here are the top 5 performers that we've had from a security burn down over the past month, or from a tickets perspective, like these amount of developers closed the most security related tickets that were introduced, or this particular engineer or developer successfully completed this big security initiative, or remediation that needed to happen, or backlog burn down, whatever it might be. And then getting them the recognition. Recognition can also be given in like pins or like some of their swag. And I think depending on the individual, they might appreciate the swag. And I think also it's getting the recognition during their performance reviews. So some companies do quarterly performance reviews, some companies do annual performance reviews. But what we've tried to do is that if an individual goes above and beyond from a security remediation or guidelines point of view, then what we do is we send a message to their manager and saying, listen, this engineer did a fantastic job and worked really well with us. And so I think that there's a lot of other non-monetary options that can greatly benefit the individual, or potentially give them like additional training, right? So let's say they are a security champion. They really like what they're doing. They've done really well. They show up on the leaderboards, and it's like, look, we'll pay for them to go attend a security training. Like, we'll train them in additional security best practices or maybe send them to a conference. And so I think that there's quite a bit of options and optionality that you can take to incentivize developers to want to care a little bit more. But I always tell people to remember like the true Pareto 80-20 rule. Like there's going to be 20% of your developers that just will not care. And you don't want to spend time on those 20% of developers. There's going to be 20% of developers that already are like those intrinsically motivated ones. And as your organization grows, like you don't necessarily want to be spending time with the top 20% either. What you really want to do is spend time with that like 60 to 80% of the middle tier developers that still require additional hand holding, that you have the ability to turn into a top 20% and really spend a lot of the time focusing on those, because that's going to be your largest portion of developers that you have.
Mm-hmm. I get it. I get it. But now I have a different perspective. If you look back from different implementation of the programs in a different places, is there a particular situation or a context that you find that things could have been done differently? I mean, you tried something, you implemented something, and then along the way you think, no, that doesn't work. I mean, we should roll it back. It doesn't make sense. Do you have kind of like lessons learned that actually are like those negative examples, like don't do
Yeah.
that, just don't do that ever?
Yeah. So a couple really good examples that I have. One, there's a lot of different vulnerability scanning tools that are on the market today. Some of them are really good. Some of them are not so good. Some of them have a lot of false positives, and some of them, they don't allow you to tune them super well. And so for some organizations that I've been part of, that I've consulted with in the past, one of the biggest challenges is that they have alert fatigue from too many scanners. And they don't know what to start, where to begin triaging, who to work with. And so immediately, as you mentioned, they get very intimidated and they don't want to help. And so it's important as an application or product security leader for your organization or as a security champion to get the data that matters and then help them prioritize or tune rules to be able to fit their organization the best. So I've been in numerous examples where alert fatigue demotivated developers from fixing alerts. And that was like a huge roadblock, right? And that leads to the second lesson learned where whether it's open source tools or enterprise tools that you procure or purchase, not every single scanning tool is going to be a great fit for your company. And so spending the time to evaluate what tools are going to fit your organization is much better spent up front than after you procured the tool and you realize it doesn't fit well. So what's a really good way to do this? One, make sure that you have a really strong partnership with your DevOps team because they're going to be instrumental in helping you along the way, ensure that the tool is properly functioning, or DevSecOps, depending on those individuals. And two, if you have security champions or specific developers, those individuals that like security, you should ask them to be part of the proof of concepts when you're evaluating these tools so that you can get developer feedback on how they feel about the performance and functionality of the scanning themselves. And so today, one of the biggest challenges that I've experienced is we might have a tool that we've procured and we're using, which is really good at getting your company from like, all right, I have no tool scanning to now I get initial visibility. And maybe that initial visibility is only in main or master branches. And that's a really good starting point. Like at least you're starting to identify issues, you're starting to understand the triage process, and you're starting to burn down any critical severity items across your organization. But that same exact tool that you've used to getting you from level 1 to level 2 might not get you from 2 to 5. And so sometimes you need to be able to sit down, take that 10,000 foot approach and be like, we're really thankful for this particular tool because it really helped us build our program from the ground up. But now that we're trying to scale our program, not every tool is great for scaling. Not every tool has specific requirements on the reporting front that you might need to satisfy your management and your stakeholders. Not every tool will work well with custom rule sets. So if you have a very unique language and it doesn't have support by the enterprise scanner, there's no open source tools, you have to build your own rules. Not every tool can support those rule sets well. And so as your program matures, it's worth reminding yourself that what got you to where you are today may not get you in the future. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges that application or product security leaders face, is because they set these goals and these metrics and these milestones when they're first building their program. But then every year you sort of need to take a step back, go out to the industry, talk to practitioners, sit at roundtables, have these discussions around best practices, and understand, is what I'm doing today going to get me to the next step, or is it going to prevent me from getting to the next step? And I've definitely been stuck in that middle zone for an extensive period of time where it's like, wait a second, I ran out of budget. This tool that I have is not working on getting me to my next maturity milestone. And maybe now I need to spend this year evaluating a new tool or a new process, and then trying to roll that out in stages across my organization to understand how is this going to perform at a much larger scale. Another challenge that I faced, and I'll end it on this one, is around two unimportant trainings. So really good trainings, the content was really good, but it wasn't applicable. And so forcing your developers to sit through non-applicable training content, not going to help anyone. It's a waste of their time. It's a waste of your time. They're not going to get anything out of it. You're not going to get anything out of it. So my recommendation is make sure that when you assign training to your developers, that you're assigning applicable training that's relevant to their workloads, that it's actionable, it's something that they are willing to share with their friends and their colleagues, and not something that's just forced down their throat.
So I mean, I just get a thought that I want to address in this on the top of the challenges that you mentioned. That definitely there are a lot of challenges, but one particular challenge that actually just hopped to my mind is that, when you have a big organization, there are always, I mean, I don't want to use a specific term, but there are always going to be this one developer that, there is a alert, there is some red or yellow color, but I'm just, click ignore. Maybe they will not see it. Maybe they will slip through and I would be able to close the ticket. We know all what you're saying. We know all what I'm referring to. There might be some situation when, I'm pretty busy this day. I'm lazy today. I don't feel like doing this today, or whatever other reason. And there's an alert popping in, and there's this beautiful button, ignore, or something like that, or mark as false positive, or whatever it can be. We know what I'm talking about. And how do you think a team can deal with this situation? It doesn't mean that there's this particular person. It might be a particular bad day that one may have. It doesn't always mean that someone is doing it every day on purpose, but there are different circumstances. Sometimes it's a approach, sometimes a bad day, sometimes a lack of knowledge, sometimes it's someone being in a hurry. I need to close the ticket because I need to finish because I'm gonna be gone in an hour, and they just click this magic button, and then the issue disappears. How do you actually think the team can tackle these problems to not slip through those real issues, but somehow not addressed in this whatever reason?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And in any application security program, you're going to see this, right? And it could just be that the developer didn't know better, right? So it's like they didn't even understand the issues, so they just set it as ignore. They provided their reason, and their reason actually wasn't relevant, and they didn't even know. And so I think that one, it's never a good idea to just assume that it was the developer's fault, right? You really want to be a partner with them along the journey, and they're going to make mistakes sometimes. Like that's just part of life. And so being there to support them along the journey is the most important thing that you can do. So what are some options that you can take as an organization? Depending on the tools that you're using, one of the suggestions that we had is much like when you're making a commit, you might get a peer review and approval or a manager review and approval on your actual pull request or merge request or whatever it might be. One option is to have that peer or manager also review the security finding and the resolution. So if you put in an exception to a particular security finding with your justification included or any relevant information, an initial first step is to have a peer or a manager review. Now, as you mentioned, things can go wrong. What if it's the team? The team as a whole is having a really bad day. And this happens, right? And there's a lot of production issues, and they're trying to push code, and the code's filled with vulnerabilities, right? And then like these things do happen. So how do you get around the team pushing, making exception approvals for themselves? So one way that you can go about this is to then do a sampling. So the security teams that you have, depending on the size of your organization, can say, okay, this month there were 200 exceptions requested. Every month we're going to review 10% of them and make sure that the justification is proper. And if it's not, then you can always say, okay, here is the justification framework that's required, and here is the remediation action plan, and here's a template, and here's train them right in how to improve their responses. Or let's say it's like a let's say it's a true positive and they marked it as a false positive, right? Like let's say you found an error, like there's a password being stored in the URL, right? And it's pretty hard to say like, no, it's not there, but they accidentally maybe submitted the exception. And so that's one of the opportunities where you would go back to the developers and say, we'll have to reopen this because it is in fact a true positive. And in the future, please make sure that, your work is being double checked before you submit. There's no perfect way to manage this at scale. I think organizations, depending if you have enough security champions and enough, like a large application security team, then what you are able to do is pretty much assign them to be reviewed all the time. But that's very hard to scale. And so if you're a really small company, it might work. Like if you're 20, 30 people and you have 10, 15 engineers, then yeah, your security individual can go and maybe manually review and approve any exceptions. But at scale, that becomes very daunting. But speaking of guardrails, this is a really interesting place because let's say someone submits an exception or they ignore a rule, but their justification doesn't satisfy the requirements. What you can do is set in a template, and it says, if the developer does not follow this template pattern, then we won't accept their exception request. So that's a really interesting place where you can put in a guardrail as well, just to ensure that they're being properly submitted. And being on the reviewed side, there's a couple different workloads. So we discussed peer review, manager approval, security approval, doing sampling of the actual submissions once they're done. And realistically, there's going to be a lot of them. So finding ways to sample size, finding ways to reduce the amount of manual time. I'm sure there's some pretty good generative AI out there now that can help you to say, hey, does this exception fit our criteria? Here is our criteria, and then actually explain to developers potentially on what they're missing or what they need to improve next time. So going back to the beginning of our conversation, in 5 years from now, we're definitely going to have some AI security bots, and they're definitely going to help developers.
So referring back on the scale, I really like this matter because some things that you describe are only possible within a given size of your organization. But what if you are a small company? You are just a team of 10 developers or maybe even less. How can you, what would you hand pick from the entire framework or the procedures that we just discussed? And because there's no resources, there's no budget and possibilities to implement a full-blown app security program. So if you are a size of 10, what did you hand pick so that it applies to this smaller scale, of the publicly facing product that they built?
Yeah. My recommendation, if you're like a really small organization, is twofold. Either A, obviously use open source where you can, because you don't want to adopt extreme costs right from the beginning. But B, as your organization begins to improve, you might want to start initially by like outsourcing some of the requirements. It could be scanning, it could be vuln management in general, but having like some trusted partner that you can work with until you can get your first security hire. But that first security hire might be 50 developers away. And so the other thing is, like if you're the CTO or CIO of a small startup, my recommendation is to explore what tools you can procure for your environment that are lightweight, that won't cost a lot. There's plenty of open source ones out there. Figure out how to get that embedded in your pipeline so you don't have to think about it. And then from there, begin remediating critical issues that you have. But once again, working with a trusted advisor and partner is only going to be beneficial for you, especially when you are at a small scale, because there might be certain requirements that you're prioritizing that don't necessarily need to be. Or there's things that should be prioritized that you're not doing today. And so I think that for that 10, 20 person company, you have to, I don't want to say check the box, but you want to make sure that you have something and that something fits the needs of your organization, at least in the short term time frame.
Mm-hmm. That's probably very challenging to adapt and actually find the proper measure. And you might try open source or outsource to the trusted organization or even individual. Did you mean maybe some a single consultant that has a proven portfolio of checks that I have checked this and that company for like 5 or 10 years and they have referred me, and it helped them to scale up in this security game? Is that the thing that you mentioned?
Yeah, that's definitely an option. Especially now, it's super easy to find freelancers, and you can find freelancers that have 10 years of application security experience, or they might have their OSCP and they've spent some time in the pen testing world, and they have run a lot of these scans. They know the recommendations, they know how to help prioritize them, and so maybe you don't need it every single day, right? Maybe you just need this individual to come in once a month or once every other month or before your major releases. And then that way you can at least get initial input without having to burn a significant amount of budget right from the beginning.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And
Does it somehow
they might also suggest to you like what type of tools might be a good fit. Because if you don't
mm-hmm,
know and you're a 5-person development or engineer organization, like you might not know what's a good fit.
mm-hmm.
And so that's another example where having someone who's been there, done that, can come in and give you their input.
I mean, can we somehow, make a round around what we just discussed, that this somehow builds a picture or maybe can we derive something like a life cycle of a product security? Is there something like a life cycle that there are some well-known milestones that we can just recommend right now out of this conversation that can be applied tomorrow or in a week or maybe in a month, so that this because we have a DevSecOps, right? So we can say that there are some kind of cycles that the commit goes. But can we look at the product on the higher level of this life cycle of security in the product?
Yeah, I
Is
mean, so
it clear what I'm trying to say? I
yeah,
mean,
yeah. There's many different models out there. So, like, I can mention a couple of them, right? You have the NIST framework for software, for secure software development. You have BSIM, um, which is another maturity model. There's also the Journey to AppSec Maturity, which is something that the Purple Book community published. And so there are many different maturity models that exist within the industry, which will explain to a company, here's where to start and here's how to grow. Here is what you should start doing from the beginning, and then here are some additional items that you can add over time. I think the best approach is to look at it from like a people, process, and technology point of view, and understand like what are the very basic tasks that I can do with people. For example, begin training them from day one. Like what are just some best practices, checklists, things that they can make sure that they're doing as a starting point. From a process perspective, let's say I run into an issue. Do I create a ticket? Where do I create that ticket? Right. So it's like understanding how to actually perform action if there is an issue identified. And then from a technology point of view, like what are you using to identify those issues, right? Maybe it's something that you've got that's open source. Maybe it's paid. Maybe it's this third party consultant. Maybe it's a service provider. And the reality is there are basic steps that you can take across your board to just get the initial visibility, to get the initial conversation going. And you need to have those conversations early and often to prevent bigger issues from happening down the line. And I've seen it numerous times, for example, where there's a startup, they release version one of their product and it's immediately broken. Like some security researcher comes in and it's just like, look, there's a SQL injection right on the main page of your site. And I've already gotten a list of all your customers' emails and passwords. Like you don't want that to happen. And it's not as common anymore as it used to be, like when Web 1.0 was still around. But the issues still exist. And so a uneducated developer can create unintentional security risk in their organization. And then as they grow, it gets harder to fix and remediate these problems. So start early and often, at least begin having the conversation. And if you are a 5 or 10 person development shop, you have to figure out what's going to work well for you without slowing down innovation and, startup mentality, right? So maybe it is just having that freelancer come in once every other week and just ping people, scan your code, run a couple dynamic tests, and get out the door, right? Maybe it is having a tool that's in your pipelines and it's scanning on every single commit. And then realistically, as you grow, those requirements will change. You'll be able to afford a little bit more, have a little bit more budget, build and find tools that fit your organization as it continues to grow. Um, my recommendation is that when you have your first 10, 20 engineers, is just identify one of those individuals and say, this is part of your task here at the startup, is to make sure that we have some basic security in controls in place. And then that way it holds someone accountable right from the beginning.
Awesome, awesome. So to close our awesome conversation, I would have a final question that actually makes a circle through the entire show. That at the beginning we talked about the future, and you are very keen on the future, and you definitely are happy about and positive. But from the flip side, based on your experience, what do you think is the most significant security or cybersecurity threat or list of threats in the next few years? Particularly in the context of web applications or application security. Things change, as you mentioned. It's good to maybe once a year step back, meet other friends or colleagues or experts. Hey, how do you approach this and that? So you kind of like reevaluate every now and then how you approach certain problems. But if you would say or one or two or maybe more significant threats that are going to be more and more relevant in the next few years, what would it be?
Yeah. So my biggest threat is going to be just software supply chain security as a whole. Specifically, diving in is to open source models, data sets, and code bases in general. More companies are using open source more than ever, and the ways to inflict damage have never been easier. So in 2020, with I believe it's Node IPC is a really good example where the developer maliciously infected his own repository in protest. And that was a really scary example because that developer had so much power because he was a maintainer and he was able to commit that code and inflicted malware on dozens of corporations, and many of them still don't know, right? And it's only in a particular version. So when you have these insider threats to these large repositories that are being used and leveraged by thousands of corporations in the open source world, it's arguably too easy for an individual developer to commit code and then have it propagate to thousands of companies and cause major damage. In the same vein, as AI is becoming more popular, right? And a lot of developers are starting to leverage open source models and data sets, et cetera, from Hugging Face, for example. It's becoming increasingly easy to not understand what is a true open source package and a not truth, and or what might be have malicious intent, what might not have a malicious intent, what might include a backdoor, what may not include a backdoor. And even Hugging Face has publicly came out and said, this is a really big challenge for us to solve. Because it only takes, one little piece of a model to poison it. It only takes, one additional file to be included. So when you download that, it's now infecting your machine or whatever machines you've deployed that model or data set to. And so now we're at a point where there's these single points of failure within our software supply chain that can have devastating impacts. And it's no longer requires, an advanced threat. It just requires someone that's really angry one day or that's rebelling against something in the world, and they can commit the code, they can make the change themselves. And before you know it, thousands of companies are now struggling with this. And so knowing, from my point of view, in the next 2 years, the rise of these supply chain related impacts are going to increase dramatically. I mean, they already have since Log4j, but they're going to increase dramatically. And organizations need to be ready that these types of issues will happen, not can happen, they will happen, and to be ready when they do, right? So having a procedure, like if you're a more mature organization, my recommendation is to have a procedure in place. So when these items get identified and leaked, that you already have a communication plan in place to reach out to the relevant teams, to create the relevant tickets that are required in order to fix these issues. Otherwise, what ends up happening is that a year goes by, 2 years goes by, and you're going to have a significant increase in tech debt due to these potentially self-inflicted damages that a single developer can make on an entire community. And so I expect there to be more dependency confusion attacks. I expect there to be more of these like critical points of failure where there's no remediations in place today, where you have the ability to inflict damage on one container, and all of a sudden, every container in your environment is going to have the same impacts. And so we're going to see a big growth in these software supply chain attacks, and that certainly is the biggest challenge that I see coming in the near future.
I mean, that sounds really scary based on what I hear, and I can completely relate to these words of cautiousness, and we should be ready as developers, as teams, as companies, as organizations to be able to identify those points as well as mitigate the already existing damage that this may occur. I mean, that is really hell of a knowledge and experience and insights and stuff that you mentioned during this hour that I really appreciate, and I hope that our listeners and viewers, depending on the platform they are listening to, will appreciate, and maybe they will ask for another show with Seth and sharing challenges and problems in the AppSec world, because it's really interesting to learn those lessons from the battlefield, not just from the books or theoretical lectures, but from the people who have their hands dirty from the dust of problems and issues solved along the way. So I would say thank you, Seth, and I hope to see you around.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate it. If anyone has any questions, you can definitely reach out to me at LinkedIn at Seth J. Kirschner, and appreciate the time today. It was great talking to everyone.